War, at its beginning, still believed in eyesight. Men stared through binoculars, scanned horizons, and trusted retinas against the ocean's tricks. A periscope glint at dawn, a feather-thin wake against a calm sea, the ghostly shape of a conning tower at sunset. These were the signatures of submarine war as navies understood it at the outbreak. Yet in the first desperate year of the Pacific struggle, the ocean proved a cruel conspirator. Vision failed, the sea hid its killers, and blind sailors died believing in light. In the winter of 1942, inside cramped Naval Research Laboratory rooms, lit not by sun but by oscilloscopes, a new doctrine whispered itself into existence. Sound, not sight. Listening, not scanning. The ocean would not reveal its secrets to eyes, but it always spoke to ears. On a metal test bench lay an object that did not look like a weapon, a tube, a float. A wire antenna no thicker than a reed, a simple label, stamped in military indifference. ANCRT-1, the first expendable radio sonobuoy. Expendable, throwaway, a single word that broke centuries of naval tradition. Sailors did not throw their instruments overboard. But engineers understood that victory might come not from what you saved, but from what you were willing to sacrifice. The sonobuoy had no engine, no propeller, no warhead. Just a hydrophone, a radio transmitter, and the courage of silence. Dropped from aircraft, it would float, listen, and broadcast the heartbeat of the sea. Not sight, but sound. Not flash, but whisper. It arrived like a rumor in mid-1942. Quietly, almost secretly, crates left laboratories and reached training fields where aircrews opened them with the suspicion men reserve for miracles. The device looked absurdly simple for the task ahead, to drag an empire's submarines out of their element by forcing the ocean to betray them. Sonar existed before it, but sonar was loud. A destroyer pinged, and the ocean pinged back. The submarine heard it too, and slid deeper or turned away. But the sonobuoy did not ping. It listened. It turned the sea into an unwilling accomplice. Early tests near the Chesapeake proved that the ocean carried machinery's confession. A diesel's thump, a gearbox's whine, a propeller's cavitation under stress. Men learned not tones but signatures, prop beats per minute, pump harmonics, the acoustic fatigue of steel frames under strain. No artist in peacetime had ever studied sound with such devotion. But listening alone does not kill submarines. A hunter needs strike as well as sense. In a separate hangar at the Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory, engineers in white coats worked with the impatience of men staring down fate. Their project moved in shadows, buried in classification, disguised even in paperwork. It was never called a torpedo. Officially, it was a mine, a bureaucratic misdirection to hide the fact that it could think in its own primitive way. Unofficially and eventually forever, it bore a name, Fido, where other torpedoes hunted with eyes, gyroscopes, periscopes, straight-run bearings. Fido hunted with ears. Drop it into the sea, and it would wait, then swim toward the loudest thing alive beneath the surface. It did not charge blindly. It listened, corrected, coasted. Listened again. A slow, patient intelligence. It entered service in the spring of 1943. Many never saw it. Most never heard it. But submariners learned to fear things they could not detect, could not outrun, and could not fight. The first squadrons to receive the paired innovations buoy and Fido were not the glamorous fighter units that filled newspapers. They were crews of tired winged patrol aircraft, Avengers and Catalinas and Liberators, whose battles were fought not in dogfights, but in the eternal dusk over endless sea. Their new orders were unpoetic: throttle back, drop, listen, wait. At altitude, the ocean looked like steel, but in headphones, it lived. Hiss of surf, crackle of foam, the deep organ pulse of distant currents, and somewhere, if fortune or skill or mathematics allowed, the throbbing heartbeat of a Japanese submarine. In 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy still believed in invincibility underwater. Their long-range boats ranged from the Aleutians to the Indian Ocean. They shelled California in symbolic anger. They sank carriers. They stalked Guadalcanal's lifeline and prowled off Noumea and Espiritu Santo. Eyes saw little of them. Ears began to see everything. An Avenger crewman over the Solomons in those early days might describe the moment as almost sacramental. A hatch opened. A cylinder the size of a thermos slid free. A small splash. Then nothing until a faint, steady signal spoke through static. Water, breath, metal, motion. A scratch of pencil on clipboard. A bearing whispered. Bearings built into a box. The hunter-killer geometry that would define the pit. War's next phase drew itself not with compasses and rulers, but with sound. Destroyers once raced blindly towards sonar echoes. Now they waited, engines idle, disciplined into silence, while aircraft planted ears in patterns above. A submarine might sit deep, engines off, smug in darkness, unaware that the sea around it had been wired to the sky. When a target betrayed itself, a pump cycling, a prop bite rising in panic, the aircrew did not attack with depth charges or bombs. They opened a bay, released a quiet shape, and counted seconds. Fido did the rest. There were no explosions at first, just a dull underwater concussion, a shudder in headphones, then the last agony of steel collapsing under pressure. No triumphal plume. No flaming wreckage, only oil rising in reluctant spirals and the certainty, logged in clipped handwriting, that the ocean had delivered judgment. In Washington, quiet men in windowless offices read after-action reports and nodded. The strategy worked. It would scale. Production ramped. A veteran destroyer captain who once trusted only his bridge binoculars now muttered in wardroom gloom that the future of naval war belonged not to the eye but to the ear. An aviator fresh from instrument school learned to treat silence as a weapon. A mathematician in a lab tuned filters the way others tuned violins. And somewhere in the Black Pacific, a Japanese navigator scribbled a final entry about calm seas and favorable currents, unaware that the ocean itself had betrayed him the moment he raised his periscope and warmed his engines. The battle for sight had ended. The war for sound had begun. In the year when the United States shifted from blindness to listening, the Pacific changed character. Men still looked out across waves, but the killing came now from what no one could see, from buoy whispers and patient torpedoes gliding in darkness, guided by a new truth. Dawn in the South Pacific arrived not with color, but with humidity and static. Haze hung over Tulagi's hills, thick as engine smoke, while radiomen in tin-roofed shacks tuned dial faces with the tenderness of men handling dynamite. They had been trained to listen not for voices, but for patterns, Morse taps in the night, faint bearings whispered by high-frequency direction-finding sets, the grainy pulse of a submarine calling home. War in the Solomons was narrowing to a science. It no longer resembled naval paintings of battleships trading broadsides. It sounded like ticks on a plotting sheet. By the first weeks of 1943, the American Pacific Command possessed something the Imperial Japanese Navy did not yet understand it had already lost: the privilege of secrecy. Hippo in Pearl Harbor, Frupak in Honolulu, and the shadowy intercept station at Guadalcanal's Lunga Point were no longer improvising, they were predicting. They listened to every coded report from Japan's submarine force, every movement signal, every routine weather broadcast. The Japanese Navy, steeped in tradition, still trusted in what had once been invincibility: silence, night, and courage. But courage could not mask metal noise. Silence was no match for mathematics, and the night no longer belonged to the hunter, it belonged to the listener. The first confirmed kill attributed to the new method came quietly. No cheer. No signal flare, no gun barrel flashing in dawn light. An I-class submarine departed Rabaul in early January 1943, bound south to cut supply lines, feeding Guadalcanal's exhausted marines. She was a sleek, dangerous vessel, trained for distant war. Her captain believed in stealth, discipline, and the Emperor's ocean. He did not believe the Americans could hear the ocean itself speaking his position. Patrol Squadron, 91 launched at dusk one lumbering Catalina flying boat whose crew had drilled the new routine until it felt like liturgy. Buoys ready, Fido primed, engines throttled down for silence when required. Hours passed over black water, the moon lifted like a coin from a gambler's palm. Then it came a shallow rhythmic pulse over the wireless headset. Not a sound, exactly, but a pattern, the ocean's heartbeat altered by machinery. The flight engineer whispered, props cavitating, slow speed, shallow depth. They dropped the first buoy. Then another, spaced by practiced geometry. Circles drawn on ocean like chalk marks around a condemned building. The hydrophone hissed, then sang not melody, but certainty. Bearing lines crossed. Confidence values assigned. Men who once measured kill chances in instinct and luck now used probabilities, decibel thresholds, bearing drift rates. At midnight, a bomb bay opened, a cylinder fell. No one cheered. Fido entered water with a sound softer than a man sliding into bed after a long shift. Then silence. Then out beyond the moon's reflection, a muted thump, followed by a shudder in the headphones. A moment later the sea lifted its first truth. An oil bloom, slow and shameful, glistening like the last breath of an empire's dream. The coordinates went into the log, clinical and exact. The pilot marked the sea with a smoke float. The war moved on. Command did not broadcast success enemy submarines were to believe in misfortune, not defeat. But Hypo logged the sinking with a penciled notation and a simple phrase, suspected Fido kill performance satisfactory. The Japanese did not understand at first. Their captains sent back puzzled notes. Enemy attacks without sound, no sonar detected, submerged discipline maintained, how located. Later some suspected airborne radar. Others whispered of traitors or spirits. A few noticed the strange drift of tiny antennas in the sea, but by then it was too late. The Americans refined their doctrine. Patrol aircraft learned to form acoustic traps. Destroyer escorts, once deaf predators, now stalked with patience. A submarine that surfaced to charge batteries risked triggering a chain reaction. DF bearings triangulated, aircraft launched, buoys seeded, Fido waiting like a coiled question. Engineers in Washington reviewed after-action reports and adjusted filter circuitry. Analysts mapped propeller blade frequencies by class. Mathematicians charted Doppler shifts of turning submarines. The ocean, once mystery, was now formula. It was not glamorous war. There were no medals for Excel spreadsheets of rustling sound traces, no trumpet blasts for radiomen scribbling arc-crossed bearings in sweat-stained notebooks. Yet this was the hinge point of the Pacific's underwater struggle. And in the Solomons, tired sailors began to sleep again. In Tokyo, the first clues that something fundamental had shifted came through silence boats scheduled to report every seventh day simply did not. Commanders waited. Encrypted messages were drafted and not answered. Patrol zones grew quiet, not through victory, but through absence. In Rabal's bunker, an officer whispered the unthinkable. The Americans have found a way to hear beneath the sea. It was dismissed as defeatism. But in the months that followed, diaries from Japanese supply officers noted the same creeping truth. Convoys became hungrier, escorts grew fewer, and underwater shadows, once obeying orders, now vanished without trace. The Emperor's long-range undersea arm, built for decisive blow, was being amputated one silent joint at a time. The American crews themselves remained cautious. They understood the ocean gave no guarantees. A sonobuoy could drift wrong, a whale might fool hydrophones. A submarine might go still and beat patience with patience. Yet every week brought another report of a contact caught, another oil slick found, another imperial hull broken silently among reef and trench. By the close of spring 1943, a phrase circulated among men who rode the listening aircraft, "Eyes lie, water does not," and in the wardroom somewhere near Espiritu Santo, a young lieutenant chalked on a slate, "Sight kills ships, sound wins oceans." The officers nodded, and no one laughed. For the era of heroic silhouettes against sunrise was dying. The age of steel nerves, slow propellers, and sonar as scalpel not hammer had begun. And beneath the equatorial moon, the Pacific, once a shield for empire, became a whispering witness against those who believed it silent. In Tokyo, staff officers spread charts across long lacquered tables, elegant maps covered in neat characters, sea lanes marked like arteries feeding an empire. The lines still ran confidently toward Rabaul, Truk, the Solomons, but the ships along them thinned. Where red pins once marked submarine patrol zones, small black X's appeared with increasing regularity. They called it bad luck at sea. Then they called it American treachery. Then they stopped calling it anything at all, because the ocean had begun to speak against them. In June of 1943, Captain Kinashi's I-19, once a celebrated hunter whose torpedoes had broken American hulls, transmitted a routine position signal northeast of the Solomons. The radio cipher was flawless, the timing precise. Hypo heard it. Lunga Intercept heard it. A Catalina climbed into evening glare. In American wardrooms, officers no longer called these flights patrols. They called them appointments. A buoy dropped, water hushed. Hydrophones tasted propeller harmonics in salt. Reports later described the contact as moderate speed, single shaft, bipolar beat pattern, intermittent blower noise. No mention of men sweating at gauges, of officers whispering over plotting tables in stale air, of the quiet dread of steel 300 feet deep where every sound might reveal you to death. Numbers, not dramas, decided modern war. At 0200 hours, Fido slid into Black Sea like a coin dropped into a temple box. The submarine's last recorded sound was a frantic acceleration, a metallic panic in the water, followed by the short, awful percussion of implosion. In Tokyo, no one spoke of bad luck anymore. They asked instead, what are the Americans hearing that we cannot hide? Japanese engineers worked frantically, unlocking technical manuals, diagramming propellers, charting decibel signatures of their own motors. Muffled exhaust systems were proposed, rubber hull coatings, strict, silent running protocols, orders issued forbidding unnecessary mechanical operations underwater. Yet sound has a tyranny beyond orders. Steel under stress sings, bearings complain. Even a careful submarine exhales noise into an ocean that, by then, belonged not to sailors, but to mathematicians. A young Japanese lieutenant, newly returned from Truk, wrote in his diary, "We move like ghosts, yet the enemy hears us breathe." In the Solomons, Allied doctrine sharpened. Before, aircraft hunted what they might see. Now they hunted what they knew. The sequence became ritual. Intercept, triangulate, plot seed. Buoys, listen, decide, release. Fido record coordinates, move on. Crews spoke in numbers and angles, no longer in guesses or instinct. Conversations shifted from, "I think she is there," to bearing drift consistent with left rudder, a just pattern. Aviation radio operators became priests of acoustics, passing faint differences in ocean hiss. Analysts in damp tin huts compared noise traces the way art historians compare brushstrokes. One whispered truth circulated in the cramped ready rooms of Guadalcanal. A submarine cannot be silent, only unnoticed. And being unnoticed was ending. Not every kill came clean. One morning, a PBY crew out of Ndeni chased a contact whose captain knew discipline. The hydrophone fed nothing but ocean whisper. The pilot circled for 2 hours, fuel bleeding away. Finally, he turned for home. Minutes later, the operator stiffened a single faint thrum, a careless pump cycle. The submarine, believing the sky empty, had blinked. The PBY reversed course. Buoys splashed. Fido sang. Silence returned. The ocean does not forgive noise. Meanwhile, American command grew confident enough to pursue submarine ambition, not merely containment. Into briefing folders crept phrases once unthinkable. Acoustic saturation zones, layered hydrophone fences, probability tracking, predictive transit models. This was not yet SOSUS that would come in a later war, stretching cables across abyssal plains, but its ghost was forming. The Pacific, once a place of romance, was becoming a laboratory. A destroyer captain remarked to a junior officer, "Battle courage matters less every month. Calculation wins now." The officer disagreed aloud, then watched 3 days later as a Japanese sub died not by depth charge hunch but by buoy grid and Fido logic. Afterward, he said nothing. In Rabaul bunkers, surviving submarine officers gave reports without raising their eyes. They described invisible traps, torpedoes that turned like predators, sounds below that felt like being hunted by mathematics. Technicians suggested countermeasures, decoy noisemakers, oscillating tail vanes, emergency dive procedures, but the Empire lacked time, fuel, and steel to build illusions. The ocean gave truth to those who listened longest. By late summer 1943, Pacific patrol logs contained fewer dramatic entries and more clinical ones. Contact classified probable I-class. Pattern dropped. Bearing variance stabilized Fido. Expended oil sighted. No survivors expected. War was becoming a ledger. The pilots, once eager for dogfights and glory, adjusted. They returned from missions, speaking not of enemy silhouettes, but of signal clarity, of hydrophone gain settings, of harmonic signatures consistent with high-output diesels. They had become students of ocean murmurs, masters of quiet violence. One wrote home, "We kill by listening now. The loudest sound in this war is absence." And so, by autumn's arrival, Imperial commanders faced the truth Hypo had grasped months earlier. The Pacific was no longer a sea of darkness. It was a theatre wired for sound. Men could vanish into night. Submarines could vanish beneath waves. But noise could vanish nowhere. The ocean stored every vibration and whispered it upward to aircraft and headphones and log sheets. And above the vast blue surface, somewhere between science and fate, Allied aircrews listened with the patience of fishermen and the certainty of engineers. Silence itself had become a weapon, and the empire that once ruled by surprise found itself betrayed by its own heartbeat. They called them patrolmen, but the title was wrong. Patrol suggests wandering, chance, the romantic uncertainty of an aviator scanning endless water for a silhouette. By the late months of 1943, there was nothing romantic about what these men did. They were not patrol. They were execution. They flew not in loops, but in equations. Avengers out of Espiritu Santo, Catalinas from Tulagi, Liberators from Henderson Field, B-24, PB-4Ys, long-winged and patient, carrying radios, sonobuoys, and the new confidence of an air force that hunted without needing to see. Eyes had become obsolete. Ears ruled now. In briefing huts built from coconut planks and canvas, charts lined the walls, not maps of suspected submarine lanes, but grids, rectangles of ocean divided by grease pencil and probability, each labelled with bearings, expected transit schedules, intercept windows. A young lieutenant, fresh from stateside training, stared at those charts in awe. Not a single line showed visual intelligence. No one bothered drawing a periscope mast. Instead, he saw HF, DF intercept arcs, sonobuoy coverage plans, Doppler drift tables, battery cycle predictions, acoustic behavior notes. Makura-class cavitation curve increases at high RPM. War was not a clash of wills. Now. It was a schedule. Instructors drilled him in words he'd never heard in flight school. Noise is not random. Everything mechanical has a rhythm. Learn the rhythm, and you learn where death is hiding. He looked at his flight assignment. He would fly in the morning. His target was not a place, it was a sound. Aircrews learned a new patience. They cut engines to idle and drifted over calm water, listening to headphones as if they were stethoscopes pressed to the ribcage of the Pacific. Hours passed without speaking. Sweat pooled in boots. Compass fluid pulsed in its dome. The hum of the aircraft itself was the enemy. Every vibration masked a possible contact. Silence became discipline. Silence became doctrine. Silence became faith. In after-action logs, pilots wrote phrases more fitting for mathematicians than warriors. Bearing convergence reached. Target confirmed by harmonic resolution. Submerged contact persistent. RPM fluctuation consistent with snorkel. Draw. Reseeded buoy field, acoustic presence reacquired. No one wrote of hatred or bravery, they wrote of signal quality. And when the water betrayed a submarine's location, there was no exhilaration, no cheering. Just a release of tension and a torpedo dropped into blue as if returning something to the sea rather than taking life from it. Some nights, crews never saw anything larger than moonlight on wave crests. Yet by dawn, oil slicks marked their work quiet proof that men they never saw now rested in steel coffins on the ocean floor. No duel, no shouted orders, no sight of enemy faces contorted in defiance or fear. Only the ocean exhaling thick black truth. A pilot once said in tired wonder, "We kill echoes." His gunner corrected him softly. "No, we kill the men who make them." Neither spoke again for the rest of the flight. The Japanese tried counters noble, desperate measures, run diesels only at night, glide on batteries by day, stop pumps whenever aircraft suspected. Limit periscope raises to seconds, reduce speed to minimize prop wash, surface only when weather stormed loud enough to mask metal. They trained lookouts to read the sky like wounded prey scanning for hawks. And still, destruction came not from sight, but from sound too faint for human hearing. The ocean had taken sides. The Americans did not celebrate, they worked. War rooms filled with chalk dust and cigarette smoke plotted submarine losses against shipping throughput. Admiral Halsey summarized it dryly. "Every one of their boats we drown saves 10 of our boys later." It was math, terrible math, but math nonetheless. In one squadron-ready room, a mechanic taped 2 quotes to the wall, from a Japanese submarine captain's captured diary. "We travel in graveyards now," and beside it, from an American sonarman, "The ocean keeps nothing secret, only quiet." The men looked at those lines before flights. They never commented on them, but they read them. Ritual replaces religion in war. Some airmen wrestled with conscience. One radio man, writing to his wife, confessed, "I never see their faces. I never even see their hulls. I hear a faint thrum, like a heartbeat far away, and then it stops. I should feel triumphant. I feel like a surgeon listening to a patient die beneath a sheet." But he flew again the next mission. War does not pause for reflection. As summer turned to autumn in 1943, Japanese naval planners faced a bitter truth they dared not speak aloud. Their submarines were no longer predators. They were hunted vessels, condemned not by superior vision but by superior patience. American crews stopped thinking of submarines as ships. They thought of them as signals. A submarine did not exist until it made noise. When it did, it ceased existing shortly afterward. And so a doctrine hardened. He who listens first lives. This was not poetry, it was policy. By year's end, the Pacific submarine campaign bore no resemblance to the myths that had filled training manuals only 2 years before. No steel wolves prowling the night, no epic periscope duels beneath typhoon skies. Only watchers, only listeners, only calibrated microphones hovering in the water like seeds of judgment. A new kind of warfare had taken hold, one where terror was a tone, death was a frequency, and the ocean floor gathered tombs unseen by any human eye. The hunters never saw their enemy. The hunted never saw death arrive. This was not cowardice, it was evolution. And beneath the surface of 1,000 miles of water, where sunlight fades and currents whisper secrets no shell or bomb could reach, the empire that once believed the sea belonged to it discovered a final, humbling truth. Tokyo never announced panic. It whispered it. Whispers in naval staff corridors, where officers in white gloves traced shipping figures with trembling fingers. Whispers in steel-shuttered conference rooms where maps no longer inspired confidence but dread. Whispers in coded cables from Rabaul and Truk that asked, indirectly, what pride would not allow aloud. The submarine arm had once been the imperial blade drawn for decisive strike. Now it resembled a brittle bone, cracking under stress no doctrine prepared for. Admirals accustomed to victory in 1941 and 1942 stared at lost ledgers like men waking from a glorious dream to find a quiet, suffocating truth. Of 40 patrol boats deployed across the South Pacific Arc, nearly one-third had not reported in weeks. Ships do not go missing at sea. Men go missing. Ships leave marks, wreckage, flotsam, signal calls, survivors. But submarines killed by silence left nothing, only absence, absence that clung like grief. At Rabaul, Captain Teraoka, senior submarine officer on station, gathered remaining commanders beneath ceiling fans that clacked like tired metronomes. Outside, humidity choked breath. Inside, discipline choked doubt. A junior commander dared to voice the fear, "Our wireless gives us away." Another, "No, it is American radar." A third older, eyes haunted, "The ocean speaks for us. Someone now listens better than we do." No one replied. They did not need to. A staff clerk recorded the meeting summary in restrained language, as though writing quietly could mute reality. Enemy interception of submarines indicates new detection method. Countermeasures under investigation. Countermeasures. A polite word for hope. The Japanese tried. They always tried. Matsuo Naval Arsenal distributed experimental rubber tiles to dampen hull vibration, primitive anechoic coatings, hand-cut, adhered with lacquer that peeled in warm water. Submarine engine chiefs received orders: reduce blower cycles, shut down auxiliary pumps, glide on batteries, surface only beneath cloud layers thick enough to hide a ghost. Crews practiced silent dives, closing valves like priests sealing tombs. Each measure made life harder, not survival surer. Batteries starved for charge. Carbon monoxide thickened in breathing air. Sweat stung eyes in stale, hot compartments where sailors whispered not for stealth, but because breath itself felt rationed. And still buoys fell. Still Fido hunted. Still oil-stained waves near lonely islands no one would ever remember by name. Meanwhile, American confidence matured into machinery. Not arrogance method. At Barracoma airstrip, a young lieutenant commander pointed at a chalkboard filled with arcs and calculated listen windows. He briefed not an attack but a procedure. Japanese boats refit on 30-day cycles. HF transmissions spike 72 hours prior. Estimated transit window past Santa Isabel between 0200 and 0500. Patrol grid here and here. Buoys at 5-mile spacing. No flares. No visual search. Trust the water. No one questioned him. This was not guesswork anymore. It was logistics wearing. Headphones. For pilots trained on dogfight romance, this new war felt unnatural at first. One aviator, a former pursuit squadron hotshot sent to fly anti-submarine duties, confessed in his diary, "I do not duel. I wait. I do not chase. I listen. When the moment comes, I press a button and the ocean does the killing. I am a witness more than warrior." But results silenced doubt. In mid-October 1943, an entire Japanese resupply effort to Bougainville vanished into the sea in 3 nights. No torpedo wakes, no surface gunfire. Only patterns, bearings, and bursts of oil on current. In Tokyo, denial crumbled. A coded dispatch reached the Naval General Staff notation, modest, implications enormous. 4 patrol submarines overdue in South Pacific sector, cause unknown. Recommend re-evaluation of acoustic vulnerability. The admiral who read it rubbed his temples. His aide whispered, "Perhaps routing them nearer the Philippines." The admiral shook his head slowly. "You may reroute a man around bullets, not around the ability to hear." Supplies thinned. Convoys shrank, messages shortened. One Japanese quartermaster officer, writing from truck, summarized the shift without realizing he had written an epitaph. "We once measured loss in ships sunk. Now in routes we dare not sail." He added a final line, unmailed, found in his papers after the war. "Even the sea has betrayed us." American intelligence officers, far from frontline glamour, smiled only inwardly. They were not men who celebrated, they verified. They charted loss not in headlines but in tonnage percentages, shipping ratios, decibel curves. In a naval hut on Guadalcanal, a chalkboard bore 3 numbers: probability of detection rising, probability of kill rising, Japanese morale falling. Next to it, someone had written in faint humor, "Noise discipline is not a strategy when your empire depends on engines." No one erased the line. By late 1943, Japanese captains abandoned initiative. They hugged coasts, crawled shallow waters, lived in terror of open sea. Reports lamented enemy patrol planes omnipresent, not omnipresent, omniscient. For the ocean itself, once Japan's refuge, now whispered treason. And through all this, Allied patrol squadrons remained strangely humble. They did not boast, they did not gloat. They returned from missions smelling of sweat, rubber headphones, and modest paperwork. They turned in reports like clerks. They walked to chow lines quietly. A naval chaplain on Guadalcanal described their demeanor. They strike without hate and return without cheer. They have accepted that victory may sound like silence. The Empire had claimed divine winds once. Now it faced divine listening. And in the final days of the year, a Japanese staff memorandum circulated quietly. American anti-submarine technique now superior. Sound is their weapon. A final note, penned in neat brush. Strokes? The sea remembers every noise. The enemy remembers as well. By then it was not prophecy, it was confession. For by winter's dawn, a truth lay heavy on every bridge and submarine wardroom from Rabaul to Yokosuka. Japan did not lose the sea to ships. She lost it to ears. The Pacific does not forgive desperation. It magnifies it. By early 1944, Japan's submarine force, once the vanguard of a rising empire, had retreated into geography, trading ocean freedom for the false comfort of reefs and island shadows. The open sea had betrayed them. Now they clung to archipelagos like wounded men hugging shoreline rocks. Captain Sato of submarine I-41 stared at charts strewn with red grease pencil slashes. Routes once bold and sweeping now resembled timid threads clinging to coastlines. His executive officer whispered what officers rarely spoke aloud. They hunt where we must pass. And so patrol lanes shrank. Depths shallowed. And silence once, a tactic became prison. American patrol planes knew the pattern. Not by luck, nor by some romantic notion of intuition, but through mathematics, fuel modeling, engine beat catalogues, and a new religion called ASW doctrine. On Bougainville, aviators briefed not enemy presence, but enemy inevitability. They traced arcs of historical travel, refueling limitations, tide studies, and radio intercept logs. Not one decision belonged to chance. They hunted geography itself. Every pass between island chains became a trap. Every predictable channel, a killing funnel. Every stretch of shallow water, a tightening noose. The sonobuoy, once a curious experiment, now fell from wings with ritual precision. They fluttered like seed pods, antennas sprouting, wires whispering through salt air before kissing the sea. Where they landed, ocean turned traitor. Beneath, faint propeller pulses betrayed life. Men above, headphones pressed to temples, listened not for loudness but for rhythm. Slow turn, battery drive, low speed. Trying to hide, it was always the same. And it always ended the same. Fido was patient. Unlike destroyers that burned fuel in anger, unlike depth charges that punished water in fury, the homing torpedo waited, listened, thought in its own primitive mechanical way. A sailor aboard a PBY scribbled in his notebook after his first Fido kill, "Our weapon is not violence. It is certainty." For when sound ceased, when Fido struck, and machinery screamed, and steel hull cracked under compressive shock, there was no plume, no cinematic explosion. There was only a shuddering bubble, a muffled implosion, and then stillness, death with no spectacle, victory without drama. As one pilot said quietly after dropping his third buoy string, "We do not fight them. We remove them." In Tokyo, staff officers studied charts devoid of good news. The Submarine Force War Diary for January 1944 recorded unexpected losses and probable ambush zones. But the language betrayed incomprehension. Enemy air presence, unpredictably effective. Unpredictable was the wrong word. The enemy calculated. Japanese intelligence clung to outdated assumptions, believing aircraft required visual sighting, believing shallow water safe, believing silence shielded. But silence only made one louder to those who listened properly. On the water, desperation birthed doomed innovation. Japanese boats crawled along seabeds. They shut engines and drifted to conserve batteries, hoping currents would carry them through. They hugged coral shelves so close that barnacles scraped hull plates. A few commanders attempted radical silence, crews barefoot, tools padded, breath held at every pipe hiss. A ratings officer aboard I-117 later recalled, "We no longer hunted, we fled." The ocean felt occupied. And still the boys fell, and still Fido whispered through water like a priest delivering last rites. When shallow stranded, subs panicked, they broke surface like trapped animals. But surfacing in 1944 was no escape. American Liberators and Catalinas circled like patient hawks. Destroyers arrived not by chance but by radio triangulation, and when surface guns barked, they barked into a hopeless sky. More than one submarine, cornered in reef-dotted passages, attempted to beach itself on friendly islands, choosing to be grounded steel rather than drowned iron. Some succeeded, only to be destroyed by follow-up bombing runs hours later. Crews scrambled onto sand, gasping, watching their steel coffin burn as tropical sun glared without mercy. One diary found in a burned conning tower near New Hanover read, "We do not fear death. We fear useless death." Meanwhile, Allied patrol crews refined an art so systematic it felt like inevitability. They spoke in calm radio brevity, buoy net established. Target bearing faint, increasing. Fido away. No emotion, no triumph, just the rhythm of professional extermination. A naval historian later described it not as combat, but as acoustic predation. By spring, Japanese command understood the truth too late. Orders arrived to reroute subs through the Philippine Sea deeper, wider waters. But Allied aircraft had already mapped that future. PBY squadrons extended patrols. Long-range PB-4Y2 privateers arrived. Radar coverage expanded. Buoy drops doubled. Japan shifted the board. America enlarged the board. An empire tried to change its map. The enemy changed the ocean. In one final desperate meeting at Truk, a submarine captain removed his cap and spoke what others dared not. "Our boats were built to stalk battleships. Now we die before seeing a mast." The silence that followed was not discipline, it was grief. Late one night, in a wardroom lit by a single red bulb, a Japanese communications officer tuned to a captured American broadcast static-laced, clipped utilitarian. American pilots discussed barometric pressure, wind shear, buoy array timing, no gloating, no cruelty, only precision. The officer wrote in his diary, "They do not hate us, they outperform us." Beneath, he added one final line, "The sea belongs not to the brave, but to the patient." By mid-1944, Japan's submarine corps sailed not into battle but into history, thinning like a whispered memory across an ocean that now belonged to sound and science. The era of steel hunters had ended. The era of invisible listeners had arrived. And in tropic dusk, as another buoy antenna bobbed on a quiet sea, and another Fido slipped beneath without splash, a young American aviator murmured the epitaph of an enemy he never saw. They went silent first. We made them stay that way. The shallows had become coffins, and the Pacific, once Japan's sword, had become a listening grave. The Pacific, in late 1944, no longer sounded like war. It sounded like absence, submarines, and once whispered through deep channels. Now nothing moved without being heard. Radio logs that once hummed with routine patrol reports fell silent. Japanese commanders called it the vanishing, and the American Navy called it what it was. At Pearl Harbor, A signals officer pinned a map to a board, an ocean spanning from the Solomons to the Marianas, and wrote 2 words beneath it. Acoustic dominion. It was not arrogance, it was measurement. Fuel tonnage. Merchant schedules, torpedo range arcs, battery endurance curves, buoy lattice spacing, air patrol cycles. Fido engagement probabilities. The ocean had become an equation, and the nation that could solve it did. In Tokyo, naval staff officers sat in a windowless basement, the air thick with humidity and dread. A lieutenant unrolled fresh loss reports. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. I-164 overdue. Row 43 radio silence, presumed lost. I-18 failed to report. The list, extended like a wound. Across the table, an older officer tightened his jaw until muscle twitched. "We are blind underwater," he said quietly, "and they hear everything." Rear Admiral Noboru Ishizaki, veteran of Pearl Harbor planning, closed his notebook slowly, as though delaying the moment would change the words inside it. "We built our boats to hunt battleships," he murmured, "and we are killed by buoys." No one replied. There was nothing left to say. The American patrol wing at Green Island assembled in the pre-dawn half-light. Men drank coffee thick as tar, hands steady not from lack of fear, but from familiarity. War had become routine, and routine was victory. A lieutenant briefed. Suspected movement along the Truk-Palau corridor. Set buoy curtains at 5-mile spacing. Maintain radio discipline. If contact confirmed, Fido authority granted. No cheering. No swagger, just men doing a technical job, a job that happened to erase enemy submarines from the Farth world. By 1944, the search pattern looked less like a hunt and more like farming. They planted sonobuoys the way rice farmers sowed paddies systematically, patiently. And like farmers, they harvested predictability. Aviation machinist mate Harold Tex Brumley said it best in a letter home, "We don't sink them, we deny them existence." Japan tried to adapt, but adaptation demanded fuel, steel, training, and time. They had none. They ordered new tactics: surface at night, submerge at daybreak, run batteries dry, lie still, pray sound passes you by. Yet the Americans widened their arcs, deepened their patrols, doubled their buoy allotments. A Japanese captain wrote in a final letter never posted, recovered from wreckage near the Marianas, "Everywhere is enemy ocean. We move only to die." In the Philippines, American invasion convoys moved like floating cities, thousands of ships, from Liberty freighters to battleships to destroyer escorts bristling with sonar domes. It was a sight unimaginable in 1942, and beneath them, Japanese submarines watched, unable to strike, pinned by sound like insects on glass. One lone submarine captain, Commander Kinashi Kazuo, Japan's most successful sub-ace, attempted to penetrate Leyte Gulf to strike MacArthur's invasion fleet. He reached the edge of the sound screen and stopped. Not because he wished to, because he was ordered, "Hold fire," he wrote in his patrol log, later recovered in U.S. Navy archives, "We see them. We cannot approach. The sea is filled with ears. To move is to die." His crew whispered mutiny, not through disloyalty, but despair. The sea that once embraced them now rejected them. American aviators rarely saw what they killed, but they felt it. On a mission near Mindoro, Lieutenant Robert Jack Hastings dropped his buoy string and listened. The faint churn of screws drifted through his headset, uneven, strained, a sub running diesels in shallow water, hoping speed outpaced sound. He wrote later, "They sounded tired, not like machines, like men who knew the door was closing." Fido entered the water without splash. It swam like an idea, not a weapon. Hastings never saw the submarine. He never saw men scatter through compartments, shouting last orders. He never heard the final scream of metal imploding. He only heard the silence after. He keyed the radio. Splash concluded. No further noise. Headquarters sent a single reply. Acknowledged. Emotion played no role. This was engineering. Post-war analysts would later estimate that more than two-thirds of Japan's submarine losses in late 1944 occurred without visual contact. No battles, no heroics, no last stands. Just the slow, clinical disappearance of a weapon system rendered obsolete by invisible science. In November 1944, a Japanese dispatch boat rescued a lone submarine survivor clinging to driftwood in a rain-lashed sea. He had escaped a compartment as his sub imploded, been dragged up by some miracle or cruelty. Before dehydration claimed his voice, he repeated one phrase: "The ocean betrayed us." It had not betrayed them, it had simply been claimed by better listeners. The American Pacific Fleet surfed not on waves but on data, hydrophone gridding, cubic law acoustic propagation, the algebra of ocean war. Silent submarines had once ruled. Then men invented a silence deeper than steel could hide. Former Imperial Navy Captain Hideo Aramaki, interrogated in Tokyo in 1946, phrased Japan's defeat simply, "We drowned before our hulls ever flooded." And he added, "We lost our empire when we lost the right to move unseen." In the end, Japan did not collapse because its submarines died. Its submarines died because its empire had already collapsed. Sound was only the instrument. The Pacific became a listening empire. And only one nation possessed the ears to rule it. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, most Americans imagined the Pacific War ending in fire. B-29 mushroom clouds, battleship broadsides, Marines raising flags over shattered coral. Few knew that the war's quietest instrument had been decisive, a 5-pound can that listened, and a torpedo that hunted noise. Peace came, but silence did not. Inside the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., the same minds who had birthed the expendable sonobuoy unrolled fresh paper across drafting tables. They traced new lines, not representing flight paths or convoy lanes, but continuous undersea acoustic curtains. The Pacific had been secured by patrols. The next era would secure oceans by permanence. A young lieutenant commander, future admiral, sonar pioneer, tapped his pencil and spoke to a room of men who were already thinking in decibels, not miles. "Gentlemen, the war has taught us something tremendous. Victory belongs not to fleets that maneuver, but to navies that hear first." The blueprint slides read, SOSUS Sound Surveillance System Concept, Permanent Undersea Acoustic Detection Network, Threat. Soviet submarines, post-war projected diesel, future nuclear, the sonobuoy anonymous soldier of the Pacific, had proven the thesis. Now the United States would go from temporary ears dropped from patrol bombers to wired-in oceanic hearing. Listening was no longer a tactic, it was strategy, then doctrine, then infrastructure. In the ruins of Kure Naval Base, Allied intelligence officers gathered logs, hydrophone notes, emergency transmissions, the broken acoustic trail of the Imperial Japanese Navy's last year. A former Japanese sonar officer, gaunt, exhausted, reviewed captured charts with them. He pointed to red-penciled arcs showing American barrier patrols and whispered, "We believed the ocean protected us. Instead, it betrayed every movement." A.U.S. analyst corrected him gently. "The ocean did not betray you. Physics did." The officer bowed slightly. Same conclusion, different vocabulary. They turned pages together. Every page said the same thing. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, a different quiet war began. The Soviet Navy, learning from Japan's fate, poured effort into submarine development. Diesel boats first. Then ambitious ideas, nuclear propulsion, deep-diving hulls, titanium dreams. But the Americans moved faster. In 1947, the Office of Naval Research classified a memorandum that read like prophecy. Future wars at sea will be decided not by armor or caliber, but by who can remain unheard the longest and who can hear through silence. They funded hydrophone arrays, ocean bottom cables, signal processing laboratories, computers the size of rooms dedicated to turning echoes into intelligence, Project Jezebel, Project Caesar. Names unromantic, but history-shaping. A simple American idea hardened into doctrine. The men who had dropped the first ANCRT-1 sonobuoys in the Solomons now found themselves teaching new aviators whose world assumed underwater visibility. By 1949, maritime patrol pilots no longer needed convincing that unseen enemies could be heard. A veteran PBY Catalina pilot, grey at the temples, voice flat with memory, addressed a classroom of young officers. "We fought submarines before you were born. We hunted ghosts by ear. Your job now isn't to hunt, it's to deny the ocean to anyone else." One student asked if submarine warfare had ended forever. The instructor did not smile. "No, but the days of unseen killers are over. From now on, they'll fear being heard." In Annapolis lecture halls, midshipmen now studied acoustics as rigorously as gunnery. Hydrodynamic engineers spoke of hull coatings, propeller harmonics, laminar flow shaping. Naval architects and physicists shared chalkboards. A naval cadet scribbled in his notebook, "War used to be decided by who saw first, now by who hears first, soon by who thinks in silence." Across the ocean, Soviet engineers reached similar conclusions, but without America's industrial rhythm or oceanographic head start. They launched boats. America listened. They improved engines. America improved arrays. They tried to disappear. America lengthened its hearing. It was a duel between silence and sound, one that had begun in the Solomons, with crude paper cones and vacuum tube radios drifting on warm Pacific swells. In 1951, the first sections of SOSUS lit up in secret. Array operators sat in dim rooms filled with reel-to-reels, spectrum scopes, and cigarette smoke. At first, the Atlantic was quiet until one night, a low, rhythmic thrum bled into the tape. A Soviet diesel boat, running on snorkel, unaware that its sound was geography now, latitude, longitude, bearing, course all from vibration. An operator whispered, "Contact, bearing 095. Range approx 200 miles, possible foxtrot." A senior civilian scientist leaned in, his voice barely audible. "Gentlemen, the oceans have become transparent. Transparency not of sight, but of sound was the legacy of the Pacific War's invisible buoy." Years later, at a quiet reunion in San Diego, the men who had deployed the first sonobuoys gathered around a table. Their hair was white. Their hearing, ironically, was failing, damaged by years of engines and headsets. Yet they spoke about silence, like artists speak about color. Commander Bill Harcourt traced a finger around his coffee cup and said, "In Guadalcanal, we were just trying to keep transports alive." Lieutenant Arthur Muller nodded. "Funny thing, we weren't hunting submarines by sight, we hunted by math." A younger officer, Cold War era, P3 Orion veteran, raised his glass to them. "Gentlemen, your war never ended. It just changed frequency. No swagger, no toast, just quiet acknowledgement fitting. For men who learned to fight with absence, by the dawn of the jet age, two truths had crystallized from the Pacific's long acoustical experiment. 1. Underwater warfare belongs to those who master sound. 2. The future of naval power would not be built in shipyards alone, but in laboratories, at drafting tables, in oceanography vessels, mapping thermoclines and sound channels. The expendable sonobuoy became a family active, passive, multistatic, digital. Fido became MARK-46, Mark 50, weapons whose ancestry traced not to battleships, but to listening devices dropped from patrol planes in a tropical war. And, in a symbolic twist, the ocean that once sheltered silent hunters now hosted microphones wired across continents, a world in which stealth required science equal to detection. History remembers battles by explosions, but empires fall in whispers. Japan's submarine arm did not die in flames, it dissolved in decibels. The Soviet Navy did not face Midway-style annihilation, it faced a wall of listening. And the men who invented this future never fired a broadside. They tuned oscilloscopes. They calibrated hydrophones. They built the quietest weapon ever forged, The sonobuoy had once floated alone on a warm Pacific sea, its heartbeat tapping quietly across static to a B-24 overhead. From that heartbeat came a doctrine. From doctrine, a network. From network, a century defined not by guns but by the science of silence. And so the ocean remained what those wartime engineers made it. A battlefield without smoke, a frontier of physics. A kingdom ruled not by admirals but by listeners,